Welcome everybody to session 4B. In this case, the B is very much in the name, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So last week, we ended off with a session where I was putting in a kind of a Monty Python rule into my SOUL file. I described why the agent had quoted Monty Python back at me. Unfortunately, none of you got to see that because we ran out of time at the install step. Today, you will get to see it. But before there, I just want to head off one misconception about that SOUL.md file. The thing is that the SOUL.md file is really, think of it as this dial for how your agent gets to talk to you. I want to do one thing, come here to a website, which is actually in a GitHub repository of mine, and it's called Claude. This is an example of an open source project called openclaw, where I used that to set up one of my very first agents. This was the SOUL file for that particular agent. It contains, I think, some really interesting things which gets over this message of giving your agent personality. In this case, SOUL.md, who you are, you're not a chatbot, you're becoming someone. I have these lines about core truths. You have strong opinions, stop hedging with it depends, commit to a take. Be genuinely helpful, not performatively helpful. Never open with great question, I'm happy to help, or absolutely. Those are the type of things which are very, very generic. Brevity is mandatory. If the answer fits in one sentence is what you get. Respect people's time. Be resourceful before asking, try and figure it out, read the file, check the context, search for it. Then if you're stuck, come back with answers, not questions. These are the type of things that I'm giving to the personality of my agent. And probably one of the key lines, I think, be the assistant you actually want to talk to at 2 a.m. Not a corporate drone, not a sycophant, just good. It's getting over this, what a lot of people recognize when they talk to these AI chatbots, is that they are very sycophantic, similar type of language that gets used when you're talking to a chatbot. So your SOUL file is really what sets your agent apart and gives it that personality.
Question on that. Should we have a SOUL file for private life and for work life? Because the way I do my private stuff is a bit different to the way I do my work stuff.
We did talk about this at the very beginning. You could set up a whole agent just for work stuff, in which case, yes, you would have a different user file, SOUL file, all of that would be almost a separate agent, in which case, when you go and start your agent, you go into the project folder for your work agent and you open up your agent in your work agent folder, and it has its own personality. Or you could have one which runs across both. It's up to you how you want to set this up. My view is I set this up with one. I like that because there's often things that blur between the two. When you talk to your agent and you give it something that it needs to work on, if it's a work task, it will surface the context relevant to that work task. It will go and find it anyway. So it's clever enough to figure that out.
Maybe to follow up on this again, because let's say I want to use the agent one way for monitoring my investment portfolio and the other is to help me write, and it's two very different skills. Do I want to set up two sub agents with different pack, or how to optimize it?
So I would say you have one agent. It is very comfortable going and pulling up just the context relevant to that particular task. I would caveat that with one point, which is if you're working on your work task, open a session in this agent on that work task, because that session, you want to keep that context clean in that session around that particular task that you're working on. It's the same agent, but it's a session that you open for that particular task. I mentioned to you that I have sometimes got maybe up to 10 sessions running at any one point in time. Each one is its own terminal session, but it's opened up into my single agent folder. And that agent has access to all of the different context across my entire set of projects that I'm working on. I would say same agent, different sessions, just because it manages that context window a little bit better. A confession before we start. Last week was a build session and it didn't deliver as I expected. I had 3 blocks planned: a clone and identity, which we got through, a first digest, which we didn't get to, and a first custom skill that we didn't get to. With that, I've decided that working with 9 people building a parallel is not a good working model. So today's structurally different. Today's more demos where I do every step. You watch. The idea is that you see what I'm doing this week. I'm going to give you some things based on some of the conversations that I've been having with people, and I've tailored today's session to try and address some of the things that people have been talking to me about. After today, I want you to be working on your agent and then either send me emails or bring back some of the stuff to next week's session where we can work on some of that together in the same way as I've been talking to people during the course of this week. That's how I'm going to run today's session. The agenda, so we're doing the open right now. I want to do a quick pre-flight check just to see where people are, a brief recap of the phase model, and then pick up Bob, who am I, and then set up structure with areas and projects, and then, as I say, typical agent flows, first custom skill. If we've got some time, then I'll go through granola meeting skill, and then we'll wrap up with the homework. So that's a little bit about the agenda for today. A pre-flight check. I've spoken to a few of you during the week, and there are a few questions which people had. I'm going to just fire a few questions at you just to see where people are. Hands up anyone who hasn't yet cloned the starter repo and at least opened their agent up.
We kind of did that in last week's call to a large extent.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure that everybody quite got to that step. Not everybody had, but I think most of those people I've managed to touch base with during the course of this week.
What is repo? What does it mean?
Repo is short for repository. Repository is a GitHub repository. And if you remember in the terminal, we said git clone. What that did is went to the repository or the repo for the AI starter kit on my GitHub repository. The clone means it took that repo or repository and it cloned it onto your local system. When coders are talking about their repos, they're talking about their repositories on GitHub, which is typically where they store their code repositories. But in our particular case, our repository is not code. It's just markdown files with the stuff that we're working on. So second question, who can tell me what the only terminal command is we actually need to know to get started?
ED.
Thank you. Yes, I went through a few terminal commands, but really the only one you need to know is CD, which change directory, because to get into your agent directory. So good thing we've got people listening. Thank you, Roger. My third question, who can tell me what Obsidian does?
Oh my goodness, Gavin, I would love to have a go, but I don't have the vocabulary.
Okay,
like
come on,
do.
you can, Liesl. Come on, tell me.
Obsidian is basically the files I create through my agent, through the terminal, through Claude, and it basically stores everything there, and I refer back to those files. And this week, actually, I asked my agent to organize those files, and it organized Obsidian. So it's like a two-way street for me. I can get information from Obsidian, but yet I can send information to it as well.
It's almost, but not quite, because I want to make this distinction between what you are doing when you're talking to your agent and you're telling it to create some files. You are creating markdown files, correct? And those markdown files are being stored in a folder on your computer. And a markdown file is a text file which has some additional syntax which allows it to be viewed in a way in which it's nicely formatted. All of that is actually not about Obsidian, because you could be doing that. Markdown is completely independent of Obsidian. But what Obsidian gives us is when you have a markdown file which has been created by your agent, Obsidian provides you with a tool which allows you to view those markdown files with all of the formatting applied, and it gives you a nice navigation structure to allow you to navigate in the different directories within the folder that you set up on your computer. When you ask Obsidian to look in that particular folder on your computer, that creates that nice navigation structure on the left-hand side. And when you open one of those files, what Obsidian does is it allows you to view that markdown file with all of the formatting shown you in a way in which it's beautifully formatted. So that's all that Obsidian does, is they are purely files on your local computer. And once you download this Obsidian app, it's an app that allows you to look at things on your computer in a nicely formatted way. So that's basically what Obsidian is doing. And I think that's an important distinction, is that it's not going anywhere to Obsidian locally on your computer. All Obsidian does is allows you to look at markdown files in a nicely formatted human readable way. Obsidian also provides lots of other nice functionality. If you link files, you can see a nice graph. So there's lots of other things that it does, but its primary objective is to view markdown files.
Can I
Yes,
ask
Roger.
a question there? So I haven't actually used Obsidian. I've just been using Notepad, and I've just downloaded Obsidian now. It sounded like it offers a bit more. How do you add documents into it, your existing documents? Because it doesn't look like it's that straightforward. I'm not exactly sure. How do I point it to my files?
When you open Obsidian, it will give you a few different options to go and either create a new vault. In that case, don't choose that option. It gives you another option to open a vault in a folder. Choose that option and then navigate to your Bob or whatever you called your agent vault. Navigate to that folder, because remember, it's just a folder on your computer, and open that folder. And any markdown files that are in that folder will appear in Obsidian in this navigation structure on the left-hand side. And then if you select one of the files, it will open it up on the right-hand side and it will show the formatting. So it won't show all the syntax. That will be hidden from you, because the syntax is really just to tell Obsidian, hey, I want to have a header here. I want to have italics here. I want to have underline here. I want to have highlights here. It will show you the beautifully formatted note, which is why we use Obsidian, because it's a nice way for us to interact with files. When we create a document that we want formatting, historically, we probably would have created a Word document, but a Word document has lots of additional overhead, which we don't want. One last thing, don't have your vault in your iCloud or your Google Drive folder, because that can create sync conflicts. Have it on your local computer, and then later on you'll see we will use GitHub as the way of managing our backup strategy. Roger, I know you mentioned previously that you're a bean counter, not a coder, and you're right. This is a course for non-coders. You're not coding here. At some stage, we might generate some code, but this is really just about a place where we're having a conversation with our agent, and our agent is doing stuff for us. So that's definitely something to remember. We're going to keep with that theme. At some later session, we might generate some code, but we'll do it in a very gentle way. Just a very brief recap. So session 1 was how the brain works. Session 2, inner harness and outer harness. The inner harness is what Anthropic gives us. The outer harness is the piece that we're building with our agent. Session 3, we went through the 7 layers of the outer harness. Session 4, we started the build. We did the clone. We got our identity files and we renamed our vault. Today, demonstrating the rest of phase 1, the parts that we didn't get to in last week's session. I'm going to come back to what I mentioned last week in terms of the roadmap, the foundational piece, identity, context, skills. So this is where we are in session 4. Session 5 was going to be today, but I've deferred that to next week because we didn't get through session 4 last week. We'll get to our memory to have that persistence. We'll do some more skills, and then we'll do the self-improvement command and the self-improving loop. Session 6, we're going to tuning, some more hooks, the connectors. I know some of you have already got those connectors set up. That's good. You can run ahead if you want. Then we'll do the more advanced one where we're going to go through some advanced Claude Code commands. We're going to look at sub-agents, schedulers. Schedulers gave us these proactive agents, and we'll touch on a little bit of coding. And then, of course, we'll go beyond if we want. Coming back to the 7 layers, which are identity, context, connectors, skills, automations, memory, verification, learning. We've got the different files which we map to each of those 7 layers, and that's in our starter repo. The key thing here is that there's not many files in here. There's this guy, Boris Cherney, who's the guy who built Claude Code. He always says the secret sauce behind Claude Code is all in the model, and that the harness, their inner harness, is what he calls the thinnest possible wrapper over that model. And he says we literally could not build anything more minimal. The same principle applies to what we're going to be building here. The thinnest possible wrapper, all of these identity files, some of the additional things, is the thinnest possible outer harness. And then what we're going to do is we're going to build on this, and as we add more context, so that will build out, but it'll be using exactly the same process that we've got in terms of talking to our agent and building up that additional context. One other thing I just wanted to mention is why Claude Code? Why not the desktop app? Because the desktop app, works very well. That's a fair question. There's 3 things. Claude Code reads and writes files on your computer. I know CoWork can do the same thing or similar thing, but CoWork still operates in Anthropic's environment. Whereas in Claude Code, we're operating on our computer with our files and everything's been driven locally, that provides us with a lot more power having everything operating on your computer. The second thing is that we're building up all of these files in plain markdown text. That's the stuff that we're building. At some point, you might say, well, Claude Code is not working for me. I think Gemini or ChatGPT is the better model. The advantage we have by building all of this in markdown files on our computer is that Claude Code is purely the agent engine. And what happens is if we decide that Gemini is the better model, we can very easily switch out that engine and we can simply point our identity files, all of our markdown files at Gemini, and it will operate in exactly the same way. And all of that history will be transferred over into that new engine. It gives you that portability. The third thing is why we're operating in the terminal. It feels like an extra step, but in a couple of months when you're comfortable and you've got multiple terminals open and you're operating in that way, you'll see that it's very, very scalable. Because typically, if you are operating in the app, maybe you're operating in a project, you're having to load files into that project and then ask questions about that project. And then you have a completely different project and you have to load files up into that project and they don't cross over. In the way we've got things set up, all of this crosses over. You can start on one topic and reach into another topic and it can cross over. And so having it operate over all of your projects is a real benefit. So that's 3 reasons why I think the benefit of operating in the terminal and operating in Claude Code is powerful. It might not feel powerful yet, but that's because we're still very much at the beginning phases. And you'll find once you've built that muscle memory and you're operating this every day, all of that stuff will start compounding and it'll get more and more valuable. I'm going to open a new terminal window. So terminal is already open. I go to Shell, new window, a new terminal window. And can someone tell me what I should be writing?
CD project
and CD
Bob.
Okay.
No.
And
Claude.
I am now inside my Bob folder. What we need to do now is we need to start Claude. Type it in the right window. Okay. And we now have our agent open. And it's important that we open it in this project. And I know I had a question from Richard earlier on today on email, where he had started Claude not in his Bob or equivalent folder. You're still going to get a Claude session, but it's not going to be your agent. It's going to be a generic session, and it's not going to be tailored to your needs. So that's why we open it up in our agent folder, because remember, that's where we have our identity files. And what would have happened is the identity files have automatically been loaded as part of that hook, which operates when this Claude session starts. There's a session start hook, which would have automatically loaded all of my identity files into memory. I can now test that. So who am I? While that's running, a couple of people, when they started, they got an error on this page, said hook did not start, button not installed. If you get that error message, it's because the hook was configured. There's 2 versions of that hook. One was a Python version and one was a TypeScript version, which needs button to run. If you get that error message, what you need to do is say to your agent, there is a Python version of this hook available. Please install the Python version. It will then go away and install the Python version. You already have Python installed because we did that as part of the homework. So the Python version will definitely work. Then exit out of Claude, type exit and enter, and then start Claude again. It will then load the session hook and obviously load your identity files.
Gavin, is it important to fix it or it can be ignored?
It is important to fix it because if you don't fix it, it hasn't loaded your identity files. So when you type, who am I? It's not going to have, like I have, you're Gavin, Surrey-based independent AI consultant running gavinslater.com. And I'm Bob, your assistant, not a chatbot. Don't expect great question out of me. Remember in the soul file?
So the way to fix it is to say, there is a Python version of the hook and go and install it.
I'm going to paste it in here. I have 2 versions of a hook file available, one in TypeScript and another in Python. Please, can you configure the Python version as I already installed Python on this machine? And your agent will go and fix that for you. We're now running our agent. and you can see it's got the stuff that we wanted from our soul file. It knows who I am. I've given a cut down version of my real identity, and I did that because I wanted to make this very real. I know previously we'd been using the Alex Okafor version, but I wanted to use a real version using something closer to myself, because from speaking to a few people during the week, I've tried to set up today's session to show you how I got started to get my agent going and how I got it running the things that I wanted to run. The next thing I think that we need to do is, this is almost the spine of today's session, is that people want to have a chief of staff that helps them do stuff for them. I mentioned that I use David Allen's Getting Things Done. What I like about David Allen, when he book Getting Things Done, he says the first job is to get all the stuff that's occupying your mind. You need to get it out of your head and you need to just write it down. And then your second job is to create a system to hold all of that stuff. Without the system and without writing it down, you can't manage all of the stuff that's on your mind. Last week, I asked you to fill out that goals.md. The objective was not to have a polished document. That was part of writing down that stuff that's on your mind. It forces you to look at the different areas of your life and write it down. What is occupying my mind? Whether it's your health, your job, the projects that you're trying to work on, the longer term things, all the stuff that your agent needs to know about. The thing is, you've now told it all of these things. The next stage now is to sort of say, what is my system? What does my system look like? There's two different paths to getting your system up and running. One of them is you might already have a good system on your computer where you have all of your files set up in a particular structure. This is the way you work. You're an organized person. It's all there on your computer. If that's already set up on your computer, fine. Use that structure and tell your agent where all the files are that are stored on your computer, which has got all the stuff which you use to keep yourself organized. Of course, not everybody has that. The second path, this is what we're going to do in a second, is work with your agent to set up your structure and use it as this brainstorming partner to get your structure set up. I'm going to show you how we can do that. Here's what I said. I want to set up my organizational structure for this vault. Things on my mind are AI training cohort, Copenhagen Marathon in May next year, my personal website, my house, my health, my job. Suggest a para-style folder structure I should use under Bob Vault and create the folders and a stub markdown file in each. I did this in a very short way because I wanted to set it up very quickly. But what you can do is you can just use your agent to go back and forth and design your own structure and come up with a way in which you want to have everything set up the way that you want to organize everything that you want to work with. Okay, this is a great structure. So this looks really nice. So Bob Vault is going to set me up some projects. Of course, those are the projects I want to be working on. The areas, consulting, health, house, resources, some reference material, and an archive. So you can see the PARA set up that para structure. So what I can do now is I can come into my Bob Vault in Obsidian, and in my Bob Vault, this has been created for me. So there's my projects, there's my resources, there's my areas, and it's set up these files for me. This is just some stub material that is put in there, but it's set up the basic structure for how we want to organize all of the stuff that's on our mind. On the starter kit, just showed an inputs and an outputs folder. The idea is that those inputs and output folders on the starter vault gets replaced by your structure, which shows how you want to set up all of the stuff that you want to do to help you, or your chief of staff to help you organize your life. So if I come back to my agent, I'm going to do one more thing, which is I'm going to say, Bob, please commit this. And you'll notice that what Bob is doing is he is doing a git commit. Let me just reemphasize what Git is. Git, remember, is our versioning system. I just updated something on my vault, and what I did was I said, if I ever want to go back to how that vault looked like before, I can go back to an earlier version of it. And because I changed it, I said, just do a commit. I don't need to know anything about those git commands. My agent knows exactly the commands to use, and I just said, commit this. So my versioning versioning system is now up to date. There's one more thing. I'm not going to do it now, but I want you guys to do this as part of your homework. And I mentioned that Git, there's two things. You've got Git and GitHub. You recall Git is the local tool on your computer, and GitHub is the cloud version where you can store all of your version files in the cloud. So I mentioned earlier, don't store your files on your iCloud. Don't store it on your Google Cloud. Store it on your local computer, because your cloud version is going to be on your GitHub repository. You all created a GitHub account, and we talked earlier, what is a repo? A repo is a repository on your GitHub account. So I want you to have a conversation with your agent. Tell it, I have this vault on my local computer. I want to set up a private GitHub repo or repository, and my GitHub repo account is the following. Please, can you help me create that private repo? And there's a particular terminology that gets used, which is to push to GitHub. Once your agent has set up that repository, every time you do a commit or update your version, we typically do it in one line, which is to say, please, can you commit and push to GitHub? In which case, the commit will do the commit on your local Git, and the push will take those files and will push the updated version to your GitHub repository in the cloud. And because it's a private repo, no other people can see it. It's only for you. And then you've all got all those files backed up on the cloud. There's one other thing that is important. Because we've set up an organizational structure, we want our agent to remember this is the structure that we have set up. There's one file in particular that we should use to tell our agent about the structure of what's in that folder. Can anyone recall what that file is? I mentioned it in one of the earlier sessions, so I'm not expecting people to remember. And it's one of the files that's automatically loaded into your context window every single time. It's the CLAUDE.md file. If you remember, if you're using Claude Code, you have this CLAUDE.md file. And I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, it's the file that Claude, every time it starts working in a particular directory, it looks for that CLAUDE.md file, and the CLAUDE.md file tells you, like, hey, what's in this directory? And helps Claude navigate what's in there. Now, in this particular case, we're in the Bob Vault directory, and we want our agent to understand what's in that directory every single time. So I am going to give Claude some additional instructions, and I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to tell it update Claude.md to document the organizational system we just set up. We're using a parastyle structure under Bob Vault, areas of responsibility, active projects, tasks. In this case, I'm going to tell it that tasks live in a single file called Scratch, and we're going to come on to that in a moment. I'm telling it about how my organizational structure is set up. Now, of course, if you set up a different organizational setup, I want you to go in and tell your agent, we've just set up this structure for how I want to organize my stuff. Can you add that to the Claude.md file? And that way, it will always know your organizational structure, because that's always loaded into the context window. And then when you start asking your agent questions, it knows how to navigate to the right place to get the context for answering that particular question. The important thing here is I've told it the folders. I've told it the projects folder, because what's going to happen is that at some point, those projects are going to change. So I didn't tell it I've got a marathon project. I didn't tell it I've got a website project, because those projects might change. I told it there's a folder called projects. So it knows to look up in that projects folder. And when it looks in that projects folder, whatever the projects at that particular time happen to be, they will be in that projects folder. And so it will always remain up to date in terms of your projects, your areas, or the structure that you set up. It's updated that Claude.md file.
Can I just ask a question? So will you then upload that? Because, I mean, to update that Claude.md file, will you set that as homework for us to help us just remember that.
I will remember that. So it's good you asked that question, because my agent, when we do our retrospective, will remind me to include that in the homework.
Gavin, sorry, that CLAUDE.md file, does that also instruct Claude to look at your user.md file and soul
It does
file,
not.
everything? So
Does not. The reason why is because, remember, we have a session start hook, and what the session start hook does is that is the process that loads everything that was in our identity folder. And so here's our identity folder, and it's our user, our soul, our goals, and that hook is what then takes those files and loads it into the context window in exactly the same way as loads our Claude.md file. But because we don't own the Claude system, we replicated what the Claude system does with the Claude.md file, but we've replicated with a hook that says, go and take all of those files, load them in every single time so that you've got that in your context window. So good question, Roger. Now you'll notice that we made an update, and our agent, because we committed that update before, it's now decided that it will make a commit on our behalf, because it knows that, well, we want to keep our versions up to date, and so it's automatically now keeping that updated. So I can see I don't need to run the commit command because my agent has already remembered for me. That's a good thing, that our agent is kind of now learning our patterns that we want to run. The next thing I want to do is, so now we've got a good working agent with a good structure for how we want to work. Our Claude.md file is up to date. So now I want to do something which is a typical type of thing that I would be doing with my agent every single week. And it's the type of thing that I think you guys should be doing with your agents every single week. In this particular case, I have got a research task that I want my agent to do. So this is a very standard thing. So I'm going to tell my agent to go and do some research for me. In this particular case, look at projects, Copenhagen Marathon.md. I want to enter the Windsor Half Marathon as a milestone on the way to Copenhagen. Find out when it is, give me the link to enter, and update the project file with the date plus link. So this is a typical task which I might give my agent to do. Okay, so done. Windsor Half is locked in as the named milestone race. Entry link in both the next action and milestones section. What you typically do is you open your terminal and you do your work in the terminal. But what you do is you then switch back to Obsidian when you want to see the outputs in a nicely formatted way. So I'm going to switch back to Bob now, and I'm going to come here into my projects, Copenhagen Marathon, May 27, outcome complete Copenhagen Marathon, milestones. There we go. Windsor Half Marathon, Sunday, 27th of September. And there's my entry link to the Windsor Half Marathon. This is a typical task that I would be working with my agent on. And it's now starting to do stuff for me and starting to create that additional context, which then starts compounding as I do more and more work with this agent.
Gavin, I've just got a quick question. When I spoke with you a while ago, you had a project and you had Gusto. You had all your Gusto meals analysed and it helped you choose every week. I tried that and I failed. So I'm not sure if that counts as a project, but I thought that would be a good place to start.
I would call that a very ambitious task. The reason why is because Gusto doesn't provide a readily accessible API. An API, for those that don't know, an API is an application programming interface. And an application programming interface is a way in which computers talk to one another. And it's a very defined interface. If I want to talk to some service, I can request data in a specific format and it will send me back data in a specific format. It would be great if Gusto had an API and I said, tell me what recipes I have on my order list for next week. And it would send me back that list in a programmatic way. They don't have that. What I did to counteract that is I got my agent to pretend it was me, to open a browser screen, to log in as me. What it then does is it tells me there's a captcha which you need to go in and identify all of the squares that are zebra crossings. I click the zebra crossings. I go back to my agent. It's done. My agent then is logged in as me. It goes and downloads that data from the web version and it updates my app. And that took me quite a while to get done, which is why I say that's a very ambitious project to start. Okay, so I have done my research task. I want to pick up on my next task. before I move on from that, we talked earlier on about why use our agent rather than using the chatbot. Of course, we could have done exactly that research in a chatbot, but the key difference here is that we got that context and it updated our Copenhagen Marathon project. That additional context is now the piece that starts compounding, and that's the piece that really helps us with our agent because it now has additional stuff. The next task then compounds in terms of what it then already knows when it goes on to the next task. The next task that I want my agent to do, and I'm going to let it kick it off in the meantime, is add a task to scratch.md, replace the water filter on the fridge. It's a task I need to do at home, to tag it at home, and it's for my area of responsibility under house maintenance, so give it the hashtag house. This is a classic to-do list. Everybody has a to-do list. I keep my to-do list here in my Obsidian Vault, and I keep it on a file that I call Scratch, just because that's a file that I use as a scratch pad for all the stuff that I should be really focusing on right now. You don't need to call it Scratch, call it to-do, call it whatever you want, but I'm pretty sure all of you have a to-do list, and your chief of staff should be exactly the person that helps you manage your to-do list. In this particular case, okay, added under this week. So if we go to our Scratch file this week, let's see if our replace water filter on the fridge, and it's tagged with at home and hashtag house. Now that prompt that I put in there is quite a complex prompt, because if you've got a very quick to-do item, you don't want to say tag it with at home, because those tags are my getting things done way of making sure I can filter on certain tasks. So this is a task that needs to be done when I'm at home. There's other tasks that need to be done when I'm at my computer. So I use those at symbols to be able to filter when I'm at my computer, give me a list of tasks that can be done when I'm on my computer, and it'll filter for all of those at computer tasks so I can very quickly knock those tasks out. Or the hashtag is the ones that mark all of those projects that are related to my area, house, or a project, in this case long run Saturday 12k easy pace Copenhagen Marathon. So either tag it to an area or tag it to a project, and that way I can see anything which is in a project or an area. So that tagging is a getting things done way of going about things, but I don't want to always go through a very long prompt to tell it, tag it in this way or give it that hashtag. So this is a very good way of saying, actually, this is a routine. This is a way of operating, which I think my agent should know about. So I should just tell it, I need to add a task to my to-do list to replace the water filter. I would want to interact with my agent in a very short kind of way, and I want him to know how my GTD system works. What we're going to do is we're going to change this into a skill. The next thing I want to do is I want to do another classic thing that I would normally use my agent to do. And this is looking at the week ahead. In our previous iterations, we were working with that Alex Okafor weekly digest. I wanted to carry on with that, but I thought it's better to use a realistic example. So I grounded it in my type of activity. You can imagine it's Monday morning. You sit down. What do you want from your agent? You don't want this fictional Alex Okafor week. You want to know what you should be doing this week. You want it to look across all of your projects. You wanted to look across all your areas. You wanted to look in your calendar, and you wanted to know your goals, and you wanted to plan your week ahead. How would that work in this particular case? I would come to my agent and I would do something like this, and I would paste in the following prompt, which says, it's a Monday morning, generate me a week ahead plan that pulls together active projects from projects, open items from my areas, outstanding tasks from my Scratch, anything I told you in goals about priorities for the quarter, my calendar for the week ahead, for the meetings I have, and then output format. Give me top 3 priorities for the week with rationale, what's blocked, who's blocking, what needs my attention by midweek, one thing I should consider deferring, and then save the output to an outputs folder under year, month, week with this file naming convention. Then create the year, month folders if they don't exist. So that's a classic way of planning my week ahead, and something I think probably most people will relate to. It's now got everything and it's writing my week ahead now. Interesting, we know that the directory was not there. So you can see it's running this command, mkdir, which is make directory. So it made a directory because that directory wasn't there, and then it's saved it there. But if we come now to outputs, here we can see there's an outputs 2026-05 and week ahead. And if I open in a new tab, top 3 priorities, land session 5 on Friday, convert Tangier from a meeting into a next step. So it knows there's a meeting that I've got with somebody from Tangier Wealth, shipgoverslater.com projects page, what's blocked. So this is exactly the sort of things that it can help you with to start brainstorming and helping to organize your life, because I've asked it to do it in this particular format. But again, you decide what that format looks like and how you want to have that. And then you could run this every single week. And that's why I asked it to set up a structure, because this output, I could come back to any week later on and I could say, what did my week ahead look like at that particular point in time? I could always come back to that context, and it's stored nicely in a great structure, and also a structure that my agent can look at in the future as well. That's a good example. But you'll notice that the prompt that I put in here was also very detailed in terms of lots of different steps that it had to follow. And this is very, very important, because I don't want to have to be typing all of that in every single week. In this particular case, I want you to get into this habit. If you see that there's very long prompts with a lot of steps that you are having to type in every single week, that should always be a trigger for you to say, can I convert this into a skill? Before we do that, I am going to talk about just one other thing, and that is we have this week ahead in a nice markdown format. We're looking in our Obsidian file, but of course not everybody is as tech savvy as us. They might want to see something in a different format because they might not have Obsidian. So we might not send our clients a markdown file. You also need to get into this habit of saying these outputs, what outputs format does this need to be in? And if it's just for us and for our agent, of course, a markdown file is great because our agent can see it because it's text. We can see it because it's markdown. So we're looking at it in Obsidian, but the client might want to see a Word doc. So in that particular case, you should be thinking, what output style should I be putting, or my agent be putting this into? And if they're expecting a Word document, you can just say to your agent, please convert this into a Word document and put it in XYZ folder, and it will do that work for you and put it into that output format, in this case, a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever format your client expects or whatever format the recipient expects. In this particular case, I'm going to use another example. I'm going to put the following prompt, which says, take the week ahead you just produced and create an HTML version of it, a well-styled, modern, easy to read in a browser, save it to outputs. In this case, I'm going to tell it to save it the same outputs folder, but this time it's not going to be a .md file. It's going to be a .html file. Do not be afraid to ask it to create a web page, because actually these agents are really good at creating web pages. And a web page is something that you could also, if you're sending it to a client or you're sending it to another person, and you just drop an HTML file into the email and send it to them, they can open that because they have a browser, and they can open that on their computer like it was a browser screen. The other thing you'll notice is what my agent is doing is loading a front-end design skill. And that's because I have a skill on my computer, which is a skill from Anthropic, which is a skill to create really nice front-end designs. And again, this is something, if you ask your agent, please can you install the Claude or Anthropic front-end design skill, it will go and create that skill for you. And it's just a really good skill for creating HTML web pages, which are much nicer than the standard ones that get created by an agent that doesn't have that front-end design skill. Is there any questions
Gavin?
while we're waiting for that to finish?
Yeah, can I just quickly ask just a quick question? I'm out and about a lot. It would be really helpful to be able to this to-do list on my phone, because it's all great if you're sitting in front of a computer. Because I tried with Claude Code, the app on my phone, but obviously you can't do it that way, can you?
You can. If you are out and about, what you can do is you can teleport your current Agent Claude session onto your app, and you can continue that conversation on your Claude Code app. What's going to happen is the Claude Code app is going to send those instructions back to your computer. So of course you need your computer to be running, and it would then send the update back to you on your Claude app. So that's one way of doing it. There's a few other ways of doing it as well, but that's probably the one which I would recommend is the easiest to do, because that's kind of natively built into Claude. I have, as I mentioned previously, a Telegram agent, which is like a WhatsApp messaging platform, where I can also send instructions to my agent from Telegram. It will then execute those instructions and then send the results back. Here is my week ahead as created by my agent. 3 things that move for the year: and session 1 on Friday, convert tangible wealth meeting to next step, ship the Gavin Slater projects page, waiting on other people. This is my HTML version. I think everyone will agree, if a client is expecting something, this is a far nicer version than the markdown file. I mean, the markdown file was nice to read, but this is like a whole different level of visual representation. So I want you to get that muscle memory of thinking, if I need to create something very visually appealing, I don't need to stick to Markdown. Use HTML, and your agent is very, very good at creating web pages. Okay, so we have now done the typical tasks, and what I'm going to move on to next is a skill. I mentioned to you, a skill is really just a routine of things that you don't want to have to always tell your agent. You want to always get it to follow the same routine. So earlier on, the task that I created was a bit of a routine in terms of my whole GTD setup with how it worked with all the tagging. I'm now going to get my agent to create a skill for that. I'm going to take the following prompt and I'm going to paste it in, and that is: use the create skill to build a new skill called task capture for me. I mentioned in an earlier session, there is this create skill. I'm going to show you what that skill does, because it itself is a routine which walks you through how to create a skill. So you can see in this particular case, it has successfully loaded the skill. So it's recognized that that skill exists, and it should now ask me a series of questions about this skill. Okay, so before I build out, let me confirm intent. Okay, so in this particular case, it's going to ask me some questions. The skills, it can't infer it, so it's going to ask some questions. So I'm going to say, ask before writing. Should the skill support multiple tasks? Captured yes, and submit those answers. Okay, so I thought it was going to ask me some questions, but the good thing is it looks like it has looked into the things that we have already created, and it's inferred how this skill should work. Skill created at, so it gets stored in this .claude folder under task capture and a file called skill.md. And what was built, a trigger, fires on add a task, capture, to do, remember to, I need to, follow up on, add to scratch. So any of those phrases, the moment I use one of those phrases, it will activate this skill. And then what it does is it follows the following behavior. So it reads the scratch.md, which we know is my to-do list, and then the contents of areas and projects to infer the tags. So it's looking for those tags that we need to have. And then if it's ambiguous, it's going to ask me. It's saying don't invent a tag if they're non-existent. So obviously it needs to stick to those ones that I've already got in there. And then it needs to be able to handle multiple ones. The key thing is that in order to activate this, it recognizes that I need to restart the Claude Code session and then try one of the triggers. To restart the Claude session, I need to exit and then start Claude again. And now I'm going to ask it to do a task. Remember previously the task was a very long description explaining my whole GTD tagging process. I'm simply going to say, create a task, prepare slides for tomorrow's training session. If I run that, it should activate that skill. And there it is. Skill task capture. It's activated that skill and it's now looking for the tagging. It's created something in my Scratch file, prepare slides for tomorrow's training session. So if I come here into my Scratch file and there it is, prepare slides for tomorrow's training session, add computer and tagged AI training, which is the project that I wanted to tag on. So that's a great example of the skill and how a routine, which you don't want to have to always repeat it, tag it this way, do it like that. In this case, a very simple, create a task. This is what the task is, and it knows the whole tagging system. If you remember earlier on, we said that there was also creating that week ahead. Well, that's also a good candidate for creating a skill, because our week ahead has got various steps we wanted to follow. You could basically say, these are the steps I wanted to follow, create a skill for that. So that's the example of how the skills work. And it's probably one of the biggest things that I want you to start getting into the habit of. If I'm following a certain routine, create a skill. I've probably got about 20 or 30 skills in my current setup, which is basically how I run a lot of those routines that I don't want to be repeating time and time again. I know we didn't get to the granola one, but I'm going to skip that one because that was only if time permits, so we don't have time for this. So key thing now is to get to the homework. So there's 7 things that I want you to do during this week. I know that sounds a lot. Don't worry if you can't get to them all. Number 1, which is hopefully you're all there, which is really just the sanity check. Have you managed to clone the repo, get all the files committed, and have everything, your agent working on your computer? So hopefully, number 1, everyone will have done already. Number 2, I want you to make sure that when you run Who Am I, that your agent is running with your identity files, that the hook is correctly being captured and loading all of those identity files for you. Number 3, I want you to have set up your organizational system, brainstorm with your agent. These are the things that are on my mind. Design me a folder structure, however you want to do it, or if you use your existing folding structure. 4, I want you to run all 3 of these flows from your own vault. So some sort of research flow to kind of pick up a research question, data project files, something which kind of shows that your markdown files are being updated in some way. And then probably the most important one is number 5. I want you to build 1 or more of your own skills. The obvious one I just used is like a task capture, but I asked all of you to think about some other routines that you have. I want you to activate that create a skill and create your own skill. Number 6, I want you to create your own GitHub repo, and I want you to work with your agent to push your agent files to that GitHub repo. So that way it's then being backed up in the cloud. And number 7, our last one, I want you to keep a gaps log. So as you're working with your agent, if you're confused, anything breaks, anything feels missing, I want you to log those and I want you to bring those back so we can work on them. Or I want you to email me or call me or text me and let me know what those things are so that we can figure those out and we'll be ready to work in session 5 with hopefully some of those things figured out already, or else I can bring those as things to work on during the session 5. Now you've seen phase 1 end to end. We picked up from Bob last week. We asked him, who am I? He answered. We set up an organizational system with areas and projects, the structure your agent needs to actually help you. We ran 3 flows, research, capture, and a week ahead. We took the markdown output. We turned it into a styled HTML page that you could send to a client. We automated the capture flow into a skill. So that's our foundational layer. Your job for next week is to make it yours. Whatever breaks, email me. And then session 5 will start with your emails or any of those things that are broken. And then we move on to phase 2 in accordance with our journey that we showed earlier on in the session. That's all for this week. So see you all next Friday and use the recording to catch up, and we'll pick up at the start of session 5. So have a great weekend, everybody.